Picture the largest civilization of the Bronze Age world, bigger by territory than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. And you have probably never heard its people's real name for themselves, because we don't know it. No pharaoh's name survives. No king's inscription boasts of conquest. No epic poem preserves their wars. What survives instead is over 1,000 kilometers of near-identical brick cities, a writing system nobody has ever read, and a silence that falls sometime around 1900 BCE and simply never lifts. Historians call them the Indus Valley Civilization, or the Harappan Civilization, after the first site excavated. At its height, around 2600 BC, it stretched across what is now Pakistan and northwest India, from the Arabian Sea coast to the foothills of the Himalayas, an area larger than 1 million square kilometers, with an estimated population that may have reached 5 million people. And then, over a few centuries, its great cities emptied out, quietly, with no burned palace, no enemy named on any wall, no smoking gun at all. Tonight we're going to walk slowly through that vanished world, and sit with a question historians and archaeologists have been circling for over a century without fully agreeing on an answer. Not rushing toward a tidy conclusion, because there isn't one waiting at the end. Just a genuinely advanced ancient civilization, the evidence it left behind, and the long, quiet uncertainty of not knowing exactly how or why it came apart. If you're settling in to drift off, let this one carry you somewhere very old and very unresolved. Let's start with the world before the silence, because you have to understand how sophisticated it was to understand how strange its ending really is. The two most famous cities, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, sit roughly 600 kilometers apart, yet their bricks were made to the same precise ratio, 4:2:1, length to width to height, as if built from a single shared blueprint. Their weights, small cubes of polished stone used for trade and taxation, follow the same standardized system across the entire civilization, from Gujarat in the south to sites near the Himalayan foothills in the north. A merchant stone weight made in one city would balance a scale in a city he had never visited, over 1,000 kilometers away. No other Bronze Age civilization achieved that kind of consistency across so much territory, not Egypt, not the early Mesopotamian city-states. Their cities were laid out on grids, streets running in straight lines, crossing at right angles, wide enough for carts, narrow enough to stay shaded through the heat of the day. Beneath those streets ran covered drains, built of fitted brick, carrying wastewater away from individual houses, many of which had their own private bathing platforms and toilets connecting directly into the citywide system. This is sanitation engineering that would not be matched in most of the world for another 2,000 years. At Mohenjo-daro, on the raised mound the excavators called the Citadel, sits the Great Bath, a rectangular pool waterproofed with layers of fired brick and natural bitumen, fed and drained through a channel too carefully engineered to be anything but deliberate, most likely used for ritual bathing rather than anything so simple as swimming. Further south, at a city called Dholavira, on what is now a dry, salt-crusted island in western India, engineers built an entire water economy into the bedrock itself. A series of massive stepped reservoirs, some cut directly into stone, channeling seasonal monsoon runoff and floodwater from two nearby streams into storage large enough to carry the city through months of dry season. Near one of the city's gates, excavators found a wooden signboard, long since decayed, that once held 10 large inscribed symbols, each roughly 40 centimeters tall, from that same unread script, possibly a civic name or title, displayed prominently enough to suggest public writing meant to be seen and understood by everyone passing through, if only we still knew how. And here is where it gets strange, if you know what to expect from a Bronze Age power. There is no palace, no temple complex anyone can confidently identify as a temple, no royal tomb layered in gold like the ones waiting in Egypt's Valley of the Kings, no statue of a king, no triumphant relief of a pharaoh smiting his enemies, no inscription anywhere naming a ruler, a dynasty, a war, or a god by name. Archaeologists have spent 100 years looking for the seat of power in these cities, and have never found anything that unambiguously fits. Some read this as evidence of a more collective, less monarchical form of governance, wealth, and planning organized through institutions rather than god-kings. Others simply say the evidence may be there. We just don't yet know how to recognize it as such. Either way, it leaves us with an enormous, wealthy, extremely well-organized civilization, and almost no idea who, specifically, was in charge of it. What we do have, by the thousands, are small carved stone seals, most about the size of a postage stamp, showing animals in profile, most commonly a bull-like creature with a single visible horn that excavators nicknamed the unicorn, though it was almost certainly meant to depict a real animal drawn in profile rather than a mythological one. Above the animal, on nearly every seal, runs a short line of symbols, 5 or 6 on average, from a writing system found nowhere else on Earth before or since. These seals traveled. Examples have turned up as far away as the city-states of Mesopotamia, alongside cuneiform tablets that mention a distant trading partner called Meluha, describing Melian ships docking at Mesopotamian ports, Melian translators working in foreign courts, even a small village of Melian residents living near the city of Lagash. Most historians now believe Meluha was this civilization, seen entirely through the eyes of someone else, since its own name for itself never made it into any surviving record, in any language, anywhere. The goods moving along those trade routes tell their own quiet story. Carnelian beads, drilled with a precision that still impresses modern craftspeople, traveled from Gujarat's workshops to Mesopotamian tombs. Ivory, lapis lazuli relate from as far as Afghanistan, and cotton textiles, among the earliest cultivated and woven anywhere on Earth, moved outward along the same routes. And among the thousands of small artifacts recovered from these cities sit 2 objects that, more than any other, seem to stand in for the people themselves. A small bronze figure known as the Dancing Girl, cast in the lost wax method, standing with one hand on her hip and an unmistakable, easy confidence, and a carved steatite bust nicknamed the Priest King, a bearded man in a robe patterned with trefoils, his eyes half closed in an expression museum visitors still argue over, calm, meditative, faintly amused. Nobody can quite agree. We do not know if either figure depicts anyone real. We do not know what either was actually called. They simply survived, 2 quiet faces standing in for an entire civilization that otherwise left us no faces at all. If you've been enjoying tonight's walk through a genuinely forgotten world, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, especially if falling asleep to something that quietly reshapes how you picture the ancient past is exactly your kind of thing. And if you're still awake enough to type, I would love to know in the comments which lost civilization you'd want an entire night devoted to next. Now, quietly, back to the silence. For over 700 years, this system held remarkably steady. Then, sometime after 1900 BCE, it began, slowly, to come apart. Notice the word slowly, because for a long time, the story told about this collapse was anything but slow. In the 1940s, the archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler excavated a cluster of skeletons at Mohenjo-daro, scattered across streets and inside rooms in the city's final occupation layers, and proposed a dramatic explanation, an invasion. Wheeler pointed to the Rigveda, the oldest surviving Sanskrit text, which describes a war god named Indra destroying fortified citadels called Pur, and suggested that invading Indo-Aryan peoples had swept in from the north, stormed these cities, and put their inhabitants to the sword. For decades, this became the standard textbook explanation. Advanced civilization meets violent conquest, cities fall, a dark age follows. Then, in 1964, the archaeologist George Dales published a paper with a memorably blunt title, "The Mythical Massacre at Mohenjo-daro," and the theory began to unravel under closer inspection. The skeletons Wheeler had used as his evidence turned out to belong to different occupation layers, spanning a considerable stretch of time, not one single violent event. Some showed no injuries consistent with weapons at all. A few had clearly been laid out with care, suggesting ordinary burial rather than bodies left where they fell in a massacre. There were no mass graves, no widespread destruction layers, no arrowheads embedded in city walls, none of the physical signature that accompanies a genuine armed conquest elsewhere in the archaeological record. The invasion made for a satisfying story. The evidence, once anyone looked closely, simply wasn't there. What the evidence does show is something quieter and, in its own way, more unsettling, a gradual decline in building quality across the final generations of occupation at these cities. Once precise brick walls become rougher. Grand public structures fall into disrepair and are subdivided into smaller, cruder living spaces. Trade goods from distant regions grow scarcer in the archaeological layers. Standardized weights, once uniform across the whole civilization, begin to vary. Writing on seals becomes less common. It reads less like a city under sudden attack and more like a slow, structural unwinding, generation by generation, of the very systems that had made these cities function at all. So if it wasn't an invading army, what was it? This is where the story turns toward rivers, and toward the sky. Running parallel to the Indus, further east, lies a vast dry channel that modern geographers call the Gagar-Hakra, a riverbed today fed only by seasonal monsoon rain rather than year-round glacial melt. And here is the striking part. Archaeologists have found more Harappan-era settlements along this now dry channel than along the Indus River itself, including major sites like Kalibangan and Banawali, built directly along its banks during the civilization's height. Many scholars connect this ancient channel to the Sarasvati, a mighty, sacred river described at length in the much later Rigveda, a river that simply does not exist at that scale in the modern landscape. Geological studies suggest a plausible, if still debated, explanation. Tectonic shifts along the region's active fault systems may have gradually diverted the tributary rivers that once fed this channel, pulling the Sutlej westward into the Indus system, and the Yamuna eastward into the Ganges system, leaving the great channel between them increasingly starved of the steady water it once carried. A river that a city was built beside, that its wells depended on, that its irrigated fields were planned around, simply beginning, over the course of generations, to run dry. And rivers were not the only thing failing at once. Around 2200 to 2000 BCE, climate records, from lake sediments and cave formations across a huge stretch of the ancient world point to a prolonged weakening of the monsoon systems that the entire Indian subcontinent depended on for reliable rainfall. This period is significant enough that geologists now use it to mark the start of an entire age, named for a cave in Meghalaya where the mineral record of the shift is especially clear. And this same climate disruption appears, at almost exactly the same time, in the collapse of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, and in the disorder that ends Egypt's Old Kingdom. Three unconnected, distant Bronze Age civilizations, weakening within a similar narrow window, under a similar shifting sky. It is tempting to imagine climate alone as a single clean villain, and equally tempting to resist that temptation, because in every one of these regions, the full story is layered, tangled together with local rivers, local politics, and local trade, in ways no single cause fully explains. The cave that gives this age its name sits in Meghalaya, in India's northeast, one of the wettest places on the planet, which is exactly what makes it so useful here. Stalagmites growing slowly on its floor, layer by mineral layer, for tens of thousands of years, record the isotopic fingerprint of the rainfall that fed them, year after year, like tree rings made of stone. Around 4,200 years ago, that fingerprint changes abruptly, recording a sharp, sustained drop in monsoon rainfall right across this stretch of the world. And back at Dholavira, with its carefully engineered stepped reservoirs built specifically to store monsoon runoff through the dry months, archaeologists have found signs that even those reservoirs, built by people who understood water scarcity better than almost anyone else alive at the time, eventually stopped being enough. Here is where the Indus story gets stranger still, because unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, we cannot simply ask these people what happened, in their own words, because nobody has ever learned to read their words at all. The Indus script survives on more than 4,000 inscribed objects, seals, small tablets, pottery, copper fragments, using somewhere around 400 distinct symbols. Most inscriptions are painfully short, 5 or 6 symbols on average, the longest known example running to only about 26. No bilingual inscription has ever been found, no Indus equivalent of the Rosetta Stone, pairing this script against a language we can already read. Over 100 attempted decipherments have been published since the script was first noticed, proposing links to early Dravidian languages, to Sanskrit, to otherwise unrelated ancient tongues, and not one has achieved anything close to scholarly consensus. The mystery runs deeper than simply not knowing the words. In 2004, a group of researchers published a provocative argument that the Indus symbols might not encode spoken language at all, proposing they function more like heraldic emblems, religious or clan symbols carrying meaning without ever representing sounds the way true writing does. The paper caused an uproar. Other researchers fired back with statistical studies, examining how the symbols pattern and repeat, arguing the sequences behave far too much like structured language to be simple emblems. The debate remains unresolved today. We are left with thousands of short inscriptions from an enormously sophisticated civilization, and cannot say with certainty whether we are looking at an unread language, a symbolic code, or something that does not map cleanly onto either category as we currently understand them. Which means, tonight, we are telling the story of one of the largest and most organized societies of the ancient world almost entirely from the outside, from their drains, their bricks, their weights, their seals, and their rivers, and almost never from their own words, because their own words remain, after nearly a century of trying, essentially closed to us. So, if there was no invasion, and no single catastrophe, what actually happened to the people? The honest answer is that they did not disappear. They dispersed. As the great cities lost the rivers, trade networks, and administrative systems that had sustained their urban scale, the population did not vanish, it redistributed, spreading outward into smaller agricultural settlements across a wider area, particularly toward Gujarat in the west, and the fertile plains along the Ganges and Yamuna rivers to the east. Archaeologists call this the late Harappan period, and its village sites, including a distinctive culture in the Punjab region known from its burial practices as the cemetery age culture, show a civilization scaling down rather than ending outright. Fewer grand public works, simpler pottery styles, smaller settlements, but continuous human presence, continuous farming, continuous, quieter life across the same landscape their ancestors had once organized into precisely grid cities. For a long time, this transition was tangled up with the arrival of Indo-Aryan-speaking peoples into South Asia, the same people credited, incorrectly, with Wheeler's invasion. Genetic research published in recent years, drawing on ancient DNA recovered from sites including Rakhigarhi, one of the largest Harappan cities, now sitting mostly unexcavated in modern India, suggests something more gradual than any invasion. Population movements and genetic mixing between local South Asian populations and groups with ancestry connected to the Eurasian steppe, arriving mainly after 2000 to 1500 BCE, meaning largely after the Indus cities had already begun their slow decline. Not as its cause, but arriving into a landscape already in the middle of transforming itself. Even that DNA evidence came at real cost. The heat and humidity of the Indian subcontinent are brutal on ancient genetic material, and researchers attempting to sequence usable DNA from Harappan-era skeletons went through dozens of failed samples for every one that yielded a readable genome. The single Rakhigarhi individual whose DNA was eventually published took years of careful work to recover, a reminder that even the scientific tools built to finally let these people speak for themselves still have to fight the same climate, the same slow decay that may have unmade their cities in the first place. What outlasted the cities, oddly, are the smaller things. Dice, cut into cubes with pips, just like the ones you might roll tonight, appear at Harappan sites, alongside gaming pieces that some researchers connect to the distant ancestry of board games still played across South Asia today. Bangle-making traditions, terracotta figurines, certain weight and measurement concepts, threads of continuity running quietly underneath 1,000 years of much simpler village life, long before anything resembling their old urban sophistication reappears in the historical record of the subcontinent. Which is really the honest place to leave this one. We know, with real confidence, that this was among the largest, most standardized, most quietly advanced civilizations the Bronze Age world produced, and that its great cities emptied out gradually, over generations, without the burned walls or foreign armies once assumed to explain it. We know shifting rivers and a weakening monsoon were very likely involved, tangled together with trade networks and social systems we can only partially reconstruct from bricks, drains, and stone weights. We do not know, and may never know with real certainty, what these people called themselves, what their seals actually say, why their script still refuses to be read after 100 years of serious attempts, or what it felt like to be the last generation walking streets their ancestors had built to a plan nobody now living remembers. Every clean explanation offered up over the last century, glorious invasion, single climate villain, sudden catastrophe, turns out, on closer look, to only be part of a much longer, quieter unraveling. The truth, as best anyone can currently tell, is a slow braid of river and rain and time, closing over one of the ancient world's most careful civilizations so gently that for centuries afterward, almost nobody who came after even remembered it had been there at all.